In our series of pre-election segments, we turn once again to the race for city councilor at large. Our guest has worked as a city council aide, along with having experience in state and county government. We'd like to welcome David Halbert. Thank you very much for being with us, David.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris. Really appreciate it.
David, I want to take you back a ways in your resume to when you were working as an aide at the city council and think about how much things have changed since then and how long it's been since we've had a male person of color elected to the council.
Yes, when I was working, it seems like so many years ago, for Councilor Sam Yoon, former at-large city councilor, and Councilor John Tobin from District 6, the council was fundamentally different, not just in terms of the people who were there, obviously that's changed, but just the composition of the council. We didn't have really any women, aside from Maureen Feeney, who was on the council at that point. Now, of course, we're seeing a majority, which is wonderful. We're seeing more representation from communities of color beyond just District 4 and District 7, which had historically been represented. And right now, of course, with Councilor Arroyo in District 5, with Councilor Edwards in District 1, and of course, prior to her elevation to Congress, Councilor Presley at the at-large level, which opened the door for folks like Councilor Mejia and Councilor Wu and others. So it's been a sea change from where I was. And I think it's for the better for the city, because one of the values of the city council as a 13-member body is that it gives you 13 opportunities to bring different perspectives, different viewpoints to the table, and informing how we see and how we develop and how we execute city policy and city government. And that's critically important. We live in an incredibly diverse city. Unfortunately, we live at times a deeply segregated city. And the only way that we can get beyond that and start working through those challenges is by making sure that others are at the table. That's why for me, as a Black man being a candidate here in this year's council election, that I'm so focused on this and really lifting up this conversation around representation, because ours is a voice that unfortunately has been absent from that table for a number of years since Councilor Jackson left in the previous mayoral election. And so I'm excited, not just for myself as a candidate, but because we have such a robust field of good candidates across the board, and particularly as a Black man, other Black male candidates as well, who are doing really good work and talking about the issues that affect us in a disproportionate way. And I think that we're going to have the opportunity come January to have a city council, and then of course paired with a new mayor, whomever that mayor is, that can create some transformative change here in the city. By the time folks get sworn in January, coming between this election and the previous election, we'll have changed about 2/3 of the city council at minimum, and a new mayor. So that really gives us an operation for generation defining changes here in terms of how we operate the city of Boston.
Well, you have all those public sector experience and even the more recent experience with the Educational Justice Institute at MIT. How would that feed into what you would be like as a city councilor?
Yeah, it really feeds into the ability to hit the ground running from day one. I tell folks all the time out on the campaign trail, whether I'm talking on the phone, knocking on doors, or in Zooms just like this, that really, once again, coming back to that practical experience of doing the work of a city council office, I understand that it's really about two things. It's about balancing out these big ideas that we need, whether we're talking about educational equity, like the conversation we just recently had about changes to the exam school admission process, whether we're talking about the existential threat of climate change and how we as a city are going to address that, and we have to address that as a climate vulnerable and a coastal city in particular, whether we're talking about what it means to have an actual answer to our housing crisis, and then we can affirm our values, and one value that I hold and that I know so many across the city hold, that housing should be a human right and that we need to have housing justice. So we have to do those big things, but we have to balance it out with those things that can seem a little more prosaic, a little smaller, but are just as critically important for quality of life. Those basic city services, making sure that when there's a pothole that needs to get filled, it gets filled, making sure that the trash gets picked up on time in front of your house, making sure that when there's a street light out, somebody comes and repairs it, because it's those small things that really contribute to how we live our life on a day-to-day basis. You got to be able to do both in this job. And that, for me, is what I'd like to think I get to bring to the table, having, once again, worked there and done this work. And then informed by other experiences that I've had working up on Beacon Hill for folks like Governor Deval Patrick, understanding how government has to work together, our state system along with our municipal system and our federal partners. A great example of that is the conversation that we've been having for some time now about the MBTA and folks advocating for a fair, free MBTA. I am in support of that as a policy issue, but I also know that Boston City Hall can't make make that happen independent of anyone else. And the only way that we can work towards that is if we're having intentional conversations with our partners in the state delegation, if we're having those same intentional conversations with our municipal partners and the other 170 odd communities within the MBTA service area, making sure that there's a critical mass of a desire and a need and advocating for why that's so important. And really, I would say taking it a step further, working with the other regional transit authorities covering other communities, because when it goes to the state level, it's a lot easier to get some political support for that when we're not just talking about Boston, we're not just talking about the MBTA, but we're talking about the Pioneer Valley Transit Authority, the folks in Springfield, or the Berkshire Regional Transit Authority, where I went to college in Pittsfield, because we want to make sure that everyone understands that it's not Boston trying to hold itself apart and away from the rest of the Commonwealth, but understand that we do better when we work together.
David, I want to ask you about the exam school policy that was just approved this week. There's an attempt there to have both inclusion rather, and excellence, merit. And there are some people looking at this, what they're focused on is, the metrics for merit. And what they're seeing is that some students with better metrics might end up getting passed over. What would you say to people like that?
Sure. This is a deeply personal conversation for all of us. I always tell folks that my most important job is not being a candidate. It's not the roles that I've had professionally. My most important job is being a father. I have two beautiful little girls, a 5-year-old who's a BPS student, a 3-year-old who will be a BPS student. So when we're talking about any conversation around Boston Public Schools, whether it's the exam schools or anything else, these are deeply personal because they're issues that my family is going to be dealing with for 15 plus years. And so I want to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to make the pathway for my daughters as reliable as possible, as open as possible, as full of promise as possible, but not just them. There's 50,000 other students across Boston Public Schools, and we need to make sure that we're investing in each and every one of them. To the point of the exam schools, we have had a long history and conversation around what we need to do to make sure that ideally our exam schools can reflect the city and the Boston Public Schools population that it serves. But it's more than that. The exam schools take up an awful lot of oxygen in our conversation around education here in the city. And while they are wonderful schools and they do deserve to be invested in like any other school, that's the problem. We don't talk about the other schools in that same way. We don't, I feel like, invest, well, at least the mental capacity and the ink and the pages of the Globe and the Herald, talking about the Brighton Highs of the world, talking about the Mildred Avenue K-8 schools of the world, talking about the Tynans of the world. We need to have that same level of focus and intensity on elevating and increasing the quality and access to quality in all of our schools. Because ultimately, what I think every parent really wants is to have a high quality school in your own backyard that can serve as a hub for your community, that your child can go to without having to go all the way across town. I remember when my wife and I were putting our daughter in school, we thankfully were able to find a great school really close to us, about 5 minutes away, high performing, and she's having a wonderful experience. But one of the schools that came up was literally a 30-minute drive. I had a 4-year-old. I didn't want to put her on a bus and send her out 30 minutes across. God forbid something should happen and she'd be all by herself. No parent wants to do that, but we will if we think that's the only way that they're going to be able to get high quality education. So our work should really be investing in being intentional about the things that we need to do to make sure that all of our students are being lifted up, not just a select few, and making sure that we're starting soup to nuts. That means universal investment in universal K0 and K1 access, because we know how critical that 0 to 5 period is for academic growth and personal development, making sure that we're thinking about things in terms of a wraparound service for our students, making sure that we're investing in Madison Park High School. It should be the nation's #1 green vocational high school, in my opinion. We have all the capacity and all the reason to do all of these things. We just have to have the will and the intention behind it.
You've been endorsed by one of the progressive groups in Boston, and I think a key phrase was for your dedication to housing justice. What would you like to see that translate into in the future as far as city council measures or policy?
Absolutely. And thank you for that. I appreciate that. It was Progressive West Roxbury and Rosendale, and I'm very proud to have their support and their endorsement among other organizations and elected officials. In terms of housing justice, as I said earlier, housing should be a human right. We have to do everything that we can, but that's once again a soup to nuts kind of approach to it. So that means making sure that in terms of development process, that we give opportunities for women-owned businesses, for minority-owned businesses to have wealth creation by being in that development process. That means making sure that when we're actually building these buildings, that we adhere to the Boston Residents Jobs Policy Program, so we can make sure that working people here in the city of Boston have access to good jobs that have protections, that have good livable wages. And it's making sure that when we finally have these buildings created, that they are addressing our needs in ways that are ideally minimally disruptive to our communities, and also that speak to the environmental component as well. I believe in what I call smart density, which is let's have these larger buildings, but let's make sure that we're siting them with intention, making sure that we're putting them next to mass transit hubs, making sure that we're putting them next to major thoroughfares where we can have the infrastructure investment, because transportation and housing are inextricably linked. So we can have things like bus rapid transit and a protected network of bike lanes all across the city, and good sidewalks that are accessible to everyone, so that once again, we can get people from out of their cars, putting particulate matter into the air in our neighborhoods and making sure they can stay and live here. And also, when we're talking about affordable housing in particular, making sure that we're having an intentional conversation about raising the inclusionary development policy number. I believe it should be a minimum of 20%, like major municipalities all across the country, but that it's not enough that we're talking about just raising the percentage. It's also about the type of housing. So we can't just have single occupancy housing. We need to make sure that we have family-sized affordable housing as well. Growing a family shouldn't mean that you have to grow your way out of being able to live here in the city that you've invested in, that you've loved, and that you've created your life in. I think those components and so many more are absolutely critical, and we have to make sure that we're having a housing conversation that doesn't just stop at the borders of Boston. Housing is a regional issue, and the only way that we're going to address it is by having a regional approach. But Boston, as the largest city and the one that's most burdened in our housing crisis, should be the one leading that conversation.
I think it's a sure bet that all candidates for council are concerned about some of the recent gun violence in Boston. But at the same time, is there something different that you'd like to see done in the police department, whether it's about the violence itself, or maybe even reimagining the work that's currently done by police?
Absolutely. The answer to every public safety question isn't an armed officer with a gun. It's not good for our officers. It's not good for our communities. So that means we have to have intentional reinvestment in more services such as mental health clinicians, substance use disorder counselors, social workers. It means when we're engaging with our housing insecure and homeless population, we need to move to a housing first model so those individuals can be situated in stable housing and get the kind of services that they need and a place and a time that they need them. It means making sure that what we are doing is going towards the heart of the most important element for public safety. And it's not an officer, it's not a gun, it's not a cruiser, it is trust. When communities do not trust the public safety services that they are receiving, they are more reticent, whether we're talking about immigrant communities that feel that they might be subject to deportation or interactions with ICE, which we know we need to make sure that there is no communication between BPD and ICE because of that, because it makes all of us less safe. When it's talking about, once again, as a Black man in this city, understanding that we have different experiences and different histories, the echoes of what happened in the Charles Stewart case are still ringing out today, decades later, because once again, going and undermining trust in those communities. And that means that we have the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency now, which is wonderful. And I'm glad it's being led by my friend Stephanie Everett, who I know is going to do a tremendous job there. But it's not enough just to establish an office. We have to make sure that office has the resources that it needs, whether it's in the city budget or in terms of the authorizing authorities to do the job that it needs to do, and that it has the independence to ask the right questions, and most importantly, to get the kind of answers that will allow members of the community to know that they've been heard, that their inquiries are being taken seriously, and that most importantly, that they're able to get an answer that they can believe in. You have to do everything that you can to establish and reestablish where necessary that level of trust if you're going to have a safe community.